speaker might leave early because he's from Grenada, the camp commander of Grenada, which is a 2-hour drive from here because I've been there, so I know. He and his dad are real big reenactors, memorial services. In fact, his dad is strictly all business when it comes to that. In fact, I almost turned and walked away one time. He's done the Oxford at the memorial for the graveyard down there several times. So I'd like for you to give a Tippah Tigers welcome to Dennie Spence from Grenada.
All right, I was talking to some of the folks earlier and mentioned that this is a 6-hour lecture, and that's true. It originated as a 6-hour lecture. Regrettably, I only get to do about 15 or 20 minutes or whenever the man in the back starts waving his hands. So, it's been about a 15-year endeavor for me. Fell in love with one particular regiment as a young kid, and it's the 15th Mississippi Infantry. They were loved back then, and they've been largely forgotten to history. And it's difficult to try and come up with one thing that you really want to talk about when you've got a lecture that spans their religion, their culture, their prior occupations, all of their engagements, and anything really from 1848 until 1910 when they fall off the face of the earth. But I finally settled on what they thought of was their worst engagement. And how many of y'all have ever heard of the Battle of Fishing Creek? Yeah, not a lot. Most people haven't. One of the neat things about Fishing Creek is it is the battle in the Civil War that lays claim to having the most names of any battle. Logan's Crossroads, Logan's Mill, Somerset, Nancy, Fishing Creek Mill, it runs the gambit. But for the 15th Mississippi, they knew it as Fishing Creek. We're going to back up a little bit before we actually get to Fishing Creek and do a really quick condensed version of who these guys were and where they were. All of them had started out before Confederate service either as pre-war, pre-secession militia companies or companies in state service before Mississippi joined the Confederacy. They had all met for the first time at the state training grounds in Grenada, Mississippi, where they learned to hate each other. In particular, companies G and E hated each other. They came largely from the same three communities, Duck Hill, Jefferson, and a little place on the outskirts of Grenada known as Spring Hill. The reason they hated each other is Company E was 96% Baptist, and Company G was entirely 100% Methodists. And they didn't like each other from the start. So with that in mind, these guys are going, there's no way we're going to serve with these yahoos. Those two companies had actually started in 1859 as a direct result of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So they wind up in Grenada, camping grounds, and the head of the camp of instruction was this crazy Irish guy that nobody could really understand. His name is really confused in history. When he served in the British Army, his name was John Michael O'Farrell. He had been an engineer in the British Army. Comes over, and he's working on the railroad that later becomes the Illinois Central, Mississippi Central, and he's building railroad bridges. But due to his prior service, Mississippi says he'd be great, let's send him to Grenada. He can train troops. Company E, the Baptists, fall in love with him. They decide this guy needs to be our captain. So Farrell, an Anglican, becomes the Baptists' first captain. And from Grenada, they're all sent up to Corinth. And it's at Corinth that Company F will record the first time that they ever received their new wonderful firearms. They were converted flintlocks, converted over to percussion, probably model, what we today would call a model 1816 and model 1822s. And the first chance they get to fire them, they're already heading north. And they were absolutely disgusted with them. There's a really comical write-up one of the Water Valley Rifles did. The entire company, 97 men, is pulled into line, and everybody has one chance. There's a board approximately the size of a man at only 100 yards. And they're going, we're all crack shots, we can kill squirrels at this distance, so surely we can knock down a man. And they step up, and out of the 97 enlisted men and 10 officers, exactly 0 hit the board, and they're going, great, because we're going to war now. So with these trusty weapons that they realize they can't hit anything at all, they leave for what they were told would be Virginia. Mississippi was going to send her 5 best regiments, and the pretty boys of the 15th Mississippi certainly footed the bill. So they hop on a train bound for Richmond, and it runs off the tracks in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're running around in Knoxville for about a week when finally Albert Sidney Johnston sends them a letter and says, congratulations, y'all are now in my department, y'all are being assigned to Zollicoffer's Tennessee Brigade, and y'all are going to Eastern Kentucky. And they're going, that is not Richmond. We didn't sign up for Kentucky, we signed up for Richmond. But this trip, the Kentucky campaign of 1861 and 62, as one of the Long Creek Rifles, Company A would put it, he refused to even talk about it. He simply said it was a hard trip. When they left Knoxville, bound for Felix Kurt Zollicoffer, they had no clue who he is. Have any of y'all heard of Felix Kurt Zollicoffer? Again, very few. Zollicoffer was a political appointee of the state of Tennessee. He had been a politician before the war, so why not? If he can lead a state, he can lead a brigade. Sure, that makes sense. The Mississippians hated him with just utmost detestation. They couldn't stand the man. He had no military expertise. He wasn't as educated as the 15th Mississippi's own colonel, who was a graduate of Dartmouth. Why should we follow this guy? We've got an entire company who came out of a college in central Mississippi. So, the Little Red Schoolhouse, sorry, we didn't actually go over that earlier. Company C, the equipment rifles, were from the Little Red Schoolhouse, then known as Eureka Springs Masonic College. They were all Freemason, college-educated, rich planters' kids. They had no reason to like Zollicoffer. So Zollicoffer's first thing is, he is then assigned to the division of George Crittenden, and they're going to defend the Cumberland Gap. Nobody's real sure from what. But they get near the Cumberland Gap, and it's at that point in time that one of Company H out of Coffeyville will say, behind every rock there was a long man with a long gun, sporting a long beard, taking long shots at our long column and running away with sparks flying up every hill. Apparently these bushwhackers out of eastern Kentucky and eastern Tennessee were accurate with their firing. One of Company B, the Winona Stars, will have his nose shot off before ever seeing combat. The colonel of the regiment, Statham, will be shot through the right arm, causing him to actually miss their first real engagement a little later on. Walthall, Edward Carey Walthall, their lieutenant colonel, one record seems to suggest that he himself may have actually been wounded for a short period. Francis Marion Aldridge, one of the signers of Mississippi's Declaration of Secession, who was commanding Company F at the time, is also wounded. Everybody's having a bad time. Rations are slow coming in. They're complaining about rice. They're getting rice constantly. And from a reenacting point of view, during Gettysburg this last year, I went up to Gettysburg and we were served rice every meal for 7 days. Rice gets old real fast. And these guys had eaten it for 3 weeks. So I can't imagine how much they hated rice by the end of the Kentucky campaign. They finally make it to Kentucky, and where they enter is at the intersection of the state lines of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And this little piece had been forgotten to history until a random letter that I'm sure was never supposed to surface ever in a million years finally came to surface a few years ago, courtesy of a descendant in Winona, Mississippi. And he's writing to one of his battle buddies, and even now I'm going to leave their names out of it, but he writes to his battle buddy in 1880s, hey, do you remember that town at the border of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky where all of those plump Dutch girls gave us the rash? And you're going, wait a minute. And then you've got to take into account that the 15th Mississippi at this time is anywhere from the age of 14 to, in the enlisted men, up to 28, with only 3 officers being older than 28. They thought they were going to their first frat party. Like it or not, they did. And they went to party hard. On that trip, on the train to Kentucky, they were so young, one of the members had actually written that I sat in the corner and had a good cry. He realized that it was probably going to be the last time that he saw his mom. It was his first time away from Holmes County, Mississippi, and he wasn't exactly having a good time with it. They finally reach where all these guns are coming from, and the bushwhackers are jumping them, and it's a little place called Camp Wildcat. Don't worry, nobody's heard of it either. Camp Wildcat, Kentucky had been a training ground for General Thomas, who will later become known as the Rock of Chickamauga. And Thomas's troops have been there the whole way. 15th Mississippi are coming up. They're getting jeered at by locals. They're going to shoot you down. It's coming. The fight's coming. Y'all will be running back to Mississippi soon. Well, they get to Camp Wildcat. They set up on the opposite side of a hill. And when dawn breaks, they come over the hill with the 19th and 20th Tennessee supporting them. And there's absolutely nobody at Camp Wildcat. It's been completely abandoned. They capture some 30-odd firearms that have been left in camp. And they claim it's a great victory. Zollicoffer then sends the 19th and 20th Tennessee out in advance, and they actually do run into federal troops, costing the Tennesseans some 40-some-odd wounded and managing to not hit a soul on the other side. So 15th Mississippi is going, I don't know what happened to those Tennesseans, but we need to get in the fight because we'll actually hit somebody. They advance forward to this little place called Fishing Creek. December 7th, 1861. They are on the wrong side of the creek from Thomas's 1st Brigade under the command of the General Carroll. And Rutledge's artillery battery lobs 3 shells over into the federal camps, and the Federals run. So, as far as 15th is concerned, that's 2 victories under the belt. Newspapers start writing them up. They manage to cross the creek, and like I said, that's December 7th. They finally receive orders. It's time to stop your general advance. You're in Kentucky. Good job. Set up winter quarters. Winter in Kentucky is miserable. I don't know if any of y'all are Kentuckians, and I'm sorry if you are. That is a detestable place in winter. There's mud, there's rocks. I don't know how mud and rocks coexist, but they do in Kentucky. The 15th Mississippi, along with the Tennesseans that they're brigaded with, the 19th, 20th, 27th, and 29th regiments, commenced to building log huts. And there's several neat maps drawn at the time that we're going, there's no way that these little log huts are actually laid out like that in the cute little company streets. Well, the battlefield at Fishing Creek is now in a private hand. You can go up there, it's a beautiful place, completely pristine, nothing's changed since the fighting. And they called in an archaeologist, and they start probing around, and the maps done by the 19th Tennessee are exact. Where they say they had a little log hut, it's there. You can count them, which is a really neat thing. Because of that, there's some great archaeology coming out of the 15th Mississippi. And we know that despite being in Kentucky, they're receiving gobs of uniforms from back home. In particular, the ladies of Lodi, Mississippi. I don't know how familiar y'all are with the Winona area, but the Winona Stars have been comprised of 2 companies, the Winona Stars and the very unoriginally named Lodi Company from Lodi. And the ladies of Lodi managed to produce enough uniforms to outfit half of the regiment that first winter. An impressive feat for a small community of about 70 people. That winter, building log huts, apparently these guys, despite their education, had never worked a day in their life. Sick call claimed over half of them. Most of them were hernias, presumably from building these log huts and slogging around in the mud. Most of them wind up going back to Nashville. Some of the unlucky few are left in the towns of Nancy and Somerset, where they just fuss miserably because it was pro-Union territory in the first place. Finally, their chance comes, what they viewed as the spring, which still seems remarkable, January 19th, 1862. For them, the ball will truly open. Zollicoffer, who is the 1st Brigade under George Crittenden, realizes that General Thomas is finally making a move south with his 3 brigades. Zollicoffer, despite having spent all winter digging near impregnable trenches, decides our best defense is to go out and meet him head on. So, the morning of the 20th, it's sleeting, mixture of snow flurries. All of the Tennesseans are armed with flintlocks, and Zollicoffer says, this is our chance to attack. Again, he was a political appointee. He first sends out companies G and E, the Baptists and Methodists, who hated each other so much, from the 15th, as forward skirmishers, with the remainder of the regiment sent behind them as brigade skirmishers, followed allegedly closely some 2 miles back by the 19th and 20th Tennessee. As companies G and E moved forward at this little place, they called it Wolf Creek. It, like anything up there, has a million names. A little ditch. They run into 10 federal cavalrymen, and they swatted them off like flies. They pursued them some quarter mile to, there's a gently inclining slope with a grove of trees behind it. And at that point in time, companies G and E run into the 10th Indiana. It's here that Company G, the Grenada Rifles, will lose its first war casualty. They've already lost 14 of their original 97 enlisted men to disease. But their first war casualty, a young private, 19 years old, on his birthday, John M. Land, a graduate at the age of 17, 2 years earlier of the University of North Carolina, is advancing in the forward line of skirmishers with Company G, and being incredibly reckless by all accounts. And the adjutant of the regiment, John Benford, will ride up and say, Land, do you not know that it is the opportunity and responsibility of the skirmisher to take opportunity to use every available coverage? John Land has apparently, according to Benford, just shot at a bale of hay. And he didn't care. He was out there doing his thing. So John Land stops and turns calmly in the face of the enemy with oncoming fire and looks at Benford, and he says, Hell, Benford, don't you know there's not yet been a mini ball made with my name? And he crumples and falls dead, shot through the head. And that was the first casualty, first war casualty of the Grenada Rifles. The Grenada Rifles surge forward with McClung's rifles on their right, and they run into the entirety of the 10th Indiana, and they are repulsed for the first time in the war. They pull back to the foot of the hill, reform into close order, and charge upwards at the 10th Indiana, 2 companies against 10, and the 15th Mississippi pushes the 10th Indiana away, because after they had fired point blank into them, Company G pulled their saber bayonets. They had 97 Mississippi rifles privately purchased by Mr. Crenshaw in Grenada. They pulled their saber bayonets and commenced hacking the 10th Indiana to pieces with them. The 10th Indiana ran away and was ineffective for the rest of the fight the rest of the day. They stop on top of the hill waiting for the rest of the regiment. Finally, the regiment comes up to them. Still, the 19th and 20th Tennessee are nowhere in sight. Zollicoffer and his staff finally ride up to meet the 15th Mississippi. The 15th Mississippi will press forward for a small ways until they realize that it's now the 15th Mississippi against an entire brigade of Federals. It's McCook's brigade. It will be George Thomas's 3rd Brigade, if that matters. And when they advance forward, they go down a ravine first, and then up a ridiculous slope. I wish y'all could go and see the slope. When you're at the bottom, you can't see the top, it's so steep. It's a steep incline and then it just plateaus out. And on the top is the 8th Ohio, the 2nd Kentucky, and the 4th Kentucky U.S. troops. Interesting note of the 8th Ohio, not a one of them spoke English. They were commanded by Germans, they were all German ethnicity, didn't speak English, they were there because they were immigrants, and Uncle Sam took them in, so they were going to fight for them. Well, the 15th Mississippi makes its first charge up the hill blindly, and they're hit by 3 regimental volleys and pull back. We're not sure how many they lost in that first real volley. We do know that all of the officers of Company D were wiped out. Company D was so decimated that they refused to pull back. They were standing on top of the hill in confusion when the regimental adjutant, John Benford, rides up and he says, "Where are your officers?" And one of them turns around and he says, "They're all dead." And he says, "Well, I will lead you." And they say, "Well, we will follow." And for the rest of the war, "we will follow" would be the 15th Mississippi's rallying cry on the battlefield. Benford then notices that the 8th Ohio artillery has just pulled up and unlimbered and is about to unload 4 tubes right at Company D, who's standing out like sore thumbs. So Benford yells, "Take the ground, boys, take the ground." And this is a scene that would haunt Benford at least until 1888 when he writes his memoirs. He said, "It seemed as though Company D had been raised from the ground, and when they came back to it, I was under them." He recalled pulling his right arm out, and one man's intestines were wrapped around his sword, and his left arm had been caught. He was still clasping a pistol, and it had been caught on another dead man's waist belt when he left it behind. Benford never forgot that, and it even tormented him to the point that at the time he was an atheist. Before the end of the war, he had finally converted to Baptist with Company E, winds up being their Sunday school teacher in the 1880s, and it shows up in his Sunday school sermon notes. He never let that scene out of his mind. Company D, or what's left of them, pulls back down to the bottom of the hill, and the remainder of the regiment is in great confusion. A, they think they've lost Company D entirely. B, where are the Tennesseans? The 19th by this point in time should be on their left, and the 20th under Colonel Battle should be on their right, and they have no support. So they all calmly, coolly, without taking fire in this little ravine, decide, let's go ask them who they are. That's what we should do. Zollicoffer earlier that morning had issued a sign and countersign of Kentucky, Kentuckians. So Lieutenant Colonel Edward Carey Walthall decides he's going to take his entire staff up there, just walk right up to him and go, "Who are y'all?" Well, a resounding reply comes back, "Kentuckians." It's Colonel Fry's 2nd Kentucky and Colonel Loach's 4th Kentucky, which just confused the dickens out of poor Walthall. They come back and they decide, "We're going to hold another council." And then finally during this council, apparently the 19th and 20th Tennessee do show up, and Walthall decides, well, we'll just go ask him again. So the regimental staff again strolls up to the top of the hill, and he asks them, "Who are y'all?" And at that time, the Federals unleash a volley that kills every regimental staff member except for Walthall, who comes out of it unscathed. And one of McClung's rifles from Company E describes him as coolly strolling back down the hill as though he were a proud peacock and saying, "Now boys, I think we know who they are. Let's give them a bayonet." So the 15th decides to sally forth one more time up to the top of the hill. Regrettably, at this point in time, the 11th Indiana has also shown up, which means, once again, the Confederates are outnumbered, where we should have, for the first time in the fight, been even. The 20th Tennessee's flintlocks don't fire. The 19th Tennessee's flintlocks don't fire. The 15th Mississippi makes it all the way up to the rail, and out of almost courtesy, the 19th decides to join them, despite having weapons that don't fire. The 19th Tennessee describes it as, "For a moment there was only a fence between us." One of the 19th Tennessee will remark that Their flintlock muskets were so long that had they actually been able to fire, they would have been able to fire into the rear rank of the Federals and not the front. They were too close to hit the front. So a vicious hand-to-hand breaks out for a short while. Casualties are uncertain, but the 15th and the 19th Tennessee do pull back one more time. They pull back under the cover of the hill. 15th Mississippi at this point in time, at least 5 of its companies are out of ammunition. And they decide, we're pulling knives, we're pulling swords, we're pulling whatever we got, and we're going back up that hill one more time. And they go back up one more time, once again assisted by the 19th Tennessee, who's just there for moral support more than anything. And they hit the fence one more time, and for a brief moment, miracle of the Lord, it seems that the 15th is fixing to break a full Federal brigade and a half. At this point in time in the fight, it's assumed that the 15th's numbers are around 200 men, and they're facing right at 4,500, and they're about to break it. I guess determination counts for more than it should. But they realize that the 19th Tennessee is falling back. The 15th Mississippi realizes at this point in time that finally the 1st Brigade has shown up Federals in their rear. And uncharacteristically of the man, Edward Carey Walthall decides to give the command, every man for himself, let's get out of here. In 1888, Benford, the adjutant, will write, "This is the first time in my life that I realized it could happen. A Mississippian could be licked, and we might not win this war." They pull back, and it's an all-out retreat. And during the retreat, they leave dead, wounded, everyone behind. The 15th Mississippi has shown up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 guys. They're pulling out with somewhere in the neighborhood of 200. About 3/4 of their casualties are wounded, but they will be left in Kentucky. And even during the retreat, they're taking fire. Benford sees his first cousin, John Campbell, fall and say, "Dear God, I'm hit, don't leave me, cousin." He walks over, and comically, the last casualty of the 15th is hands down the most minor. Benford walks over to him, says, "Where are you hit?" And he says, "It's my leg, I can't feel it at all. A mini ball has gone through his cartridge box and hit his leg so hard that it deadened it." And when Benford lifted up the cartridge box to look at the wound, the spent mini ball fell out, and Campbell gets up and continues on. Winds up dying at Franklin, but he survived Fishing Creek. They make it back to Confederate camp at Beech Grove, and there's an all-out fist fight because there's only one little boat to get them back across the river, known as the Noble Ellis. Problem is, the Noble Ellis can only hold about 60 guys, and here are 5 Confederate regiments trying to get out of there. The 15th Mississippi decides that they have rights. They suffered the most. They were the farthest away from home, and Tennessee could just hold up. So the 15th Mississippi, as many as possible, pile onto the first trip of the Noble Ellis. 3 more trips later, the 15th is safely across, but in their orders to evacuate, they were told to leave everything except for 1 blanket and your infantry accoutrements, which meant there was no food. There was 1 blanket per man. It was January in Kentucky and central Tennessee, and their destination was Nashville. And that is probably why the member of Company A, F.M. Glass, decided to only say it was a hard trip. That's an incredibly abbreviated story of their winter of 61 and 62 in eastern Kentucky. They retreat back through Nashville. The Tennesseans fall in love with the 15th Mississippi's colonel. They actually write 7 letters to President Davis himself demanding that Statham, colonel of the 15th Mississippi, be given a brigadier generalship. It never comes through. The state of Tennessee actually shunned her own troops for not taking as many casualties as the Mississippians. And the state of Tennessee awards the 15th Mississippi the uniform on the right, if you're looking at it, state of Tennessee regulation uniforms, because they had nothing after the retreat. When they went through Nashville, every man got a new uniform and a new knapsack. When they hit Meridian, Mississippi, the state of Mississippi just kind of gave them a thumbs up and promised a reward later. One day before the Battle of Shiloh, the entire regiment was given 54 caliber Austrian Lorenzes for valor on the field at Fishing Creek. And I've been waved off about 10 minutes ago, so that concludes that.